Okay, so today we're really diving into one of those stories that kind of sticks with you. You know, those stories, the ones that make you think and maybe wrestle with some big questions. You know what I mean?
Oh, absolutely. Those stories that really get under your skin.
Exactly. And the one we're tackling today, it's the story of al-Khidr from the Qur'an.
Ah, fascinating choice. Lots to unpack there.
Right. And to help us do that, we're going to be looking at excerpts from this book, The Quranic Dilemma by Abla Hassan.
Okay, great book. Really digs into some thorny issues.
It really does. And specifically, we're going to be looking at what this story, this al-Khidr story, what it reveals about Islam's perspective on violence, particularly violence that's driven by, religious differences.
Yeah, a topic that unfortunately remains all too relevant.
Sadly, yes. Now, you might already be familiar with the story, like with the basic outline. Moses, right?
Yeah.
Always striving for knowledge.
Of course.
He hears about this mysterious figure, al-Khidr, who's supposed to possess, like, this incredible divine knowledge. So Moses, being Moses, he sets out to find him.
Driven by that thirst for wisdom.
Totally. And when he finally finds al-Khidr agrees to teach him, but,
Yeah.
and there's always a but.
Right, there's a catch.
A big one. Al-Khidr basically says, look, I'll show you the way, but you can't question anything I do, no matter how strange it seems.
And let's just say strange might be an understatement.
That's putting it mildly. Because as they journey together, al-Khidr does some things, well, let's just say some things, that on the surface seem downright wrong. Like, he damages this boat, right, the boat that was giving them passage, and then, well, he takes the life of a young boy, seemingly out of nowhere.
It's a jarring sequence of events. And each time, Moses is left grappling with what he's seeing, trying to reconcile it with everything he understands about right and wrong.
It really makes you question things, right?
Yeah.
Like, what's the purpose of these actions?
It's like the story is forcing us to confront our own assumptions about morality.
Yeah, totally. And out of all the things that al-Khidr does, the part that always seems to get to people, the thing that sparks the most debate and confusion, is the taking of that young boy's life.
I can see why. It's one thing to damage property, but taking a life, especially a young life, it feels different,
It feels incredibly difficult to reconcile with this idea of a merciful God, right?
It really does, and it leads to this question that people have been wrestling with for centuries. How can this act possibly be justified? Especially within the framework of Islam, a religion that stresses the sanctity of life so strongly.
Exactly. So is there something we're missing here? Could this be some sort of parable, with a deeper meaning hidden beneath the surface?
It's certainly possible. There's often more to these stories than meets the eye.
And ultimately, what does this story tell us about how the Quran views things like freedom of religion, the absolute value of life itself? These are weighty questions.
They really are. And I think to start unpacking them, we have to acknowledge the tension, the inherent dilemma that this story presents.
It's a dilemma for sure. And the book really dives into that. It doesn't shy away from this traditional interpretation of the story, this idea that al-Khidr killed the boy because he was, destined to become an infidel, someone who rejects the Islamic faith.
Exactly. And to be fair, it lays out that reasoning so we can understand how people arrived at that understanding.
Right. Like it gives that view a fair hearing.
It does. It even cites specific scholars like Ibn Qayyim al-Jawziyah. He was a really prominent Islamic thinker, and he argued that God actually revealed the boy's future path to al-Khidr.
Oh, wow. So it's like this whole preordained thing.
Exactly. So in this interpretation, the boy's death, it's seen as part of this this larger divine plan. And I know that's a really difficult concept to kind of wrap your head around today, but for a long time, that was actually a widely accepted interpretation of the story.
Wow. Okay. So we're not talking about some fringe theory here. This was a mainstream way of understanding this.
Absolutely. This was how a lot of people understood the story. However, the book points out that there are some issues with this interpretation. Like when you really start to unpack it, it bumps up against some other core teachings of Islam.
Like what? Give me an example.
Well, one of the biggest clashes is with how much emphasis the Qur'an puts on the sanctity of life.
Right, of course. That's a huge part of Islam.
Right, like there's that verse, 5.32, that says, to save a life is like saving all of humanity. It's a really powerful statement.
It really is.
Yeah.
And it makes this whole thing even more puzzling, If taking a life, especially an innocent life, is considered such a grave act, I mean, how does that fit with this traditional interpretation of the al-Khidr story?
Exactly, and it's a question a lot of people have grappled with. It really challenges this idea that al-Khidr's actions, in this case, are something to be emulated. It makes you think, can you really reconcile preemptively taking a life, even if you believe you know someone's future, with the principles of mercy and justice that are so central to Islam?
Especially when the future actions we're talking about are about a person's beliefs,
Mm-hmm.
right? Like, it seems like it goes against the whole idea of freedom of religion. The Qur'an is pretty clear that people have the right to choose their own fate.
Absolutely. And even if we set aside the moral questions for a minute and we just look at it from a purely legal standpoint, like Islamic law is very clear that punishment, even for things that are considered, against the faith, punishment can only be given by a legitimate authority, not by some random person.
Right. So even if you accept the premise the way it happens in the story, that's not how things are supposed to work.
Exactly. So you start to see how this traditional interpretation, it kind of unravels a bit when you start to poke at it.
Okay, so if that's not quite right, if this traditional way of understanding the story contradicts other things in the Quran, what are we missing?
Well, the book seems to think there's a more nuanced way to look at it.
Okay, I'm listening. Tell me more.
It suggests that we need to look beyond just the surface of the text. Think about the context, the literary tools being used.
Get into the nitty-gritty of it.
Exactly. For example, it wants us to consider the story of Abraham being commanded by God to sacrifice his son Isaac.
Oh, right. Now, that's a story that's, it's part of a lot of different faiths, although I think it's often misinterpreted.
You're right. There are a lot of layers to that story.
Yeah, and I mean, the Quran doesn't focus on those graphic details in the same way that, some other versions of the story do. Like, it really emphasizes God's mercy, which in the end means a ram is provided as a sacrifice instead of Isaac.
Right, exactly.
But the core of the story, the part that I think connects to the al-Khidr story, is that they both involve these seemingly impossible commands from God. You know what I mean?
Right.
These things that seem totally unjust and even cruel when you try to look at them from like a human perspective.
Exactly. And I think by, bringing up these parallels, the book is really pushing us to consider, is there something more going on here? Like, is there this divine logic that we, with our limited human understanding, just can't fully grasp?
So is it saying that maybe, just maybe, there's a bigger picture here than we're seeing?
It could be. And I think it's important to remember that the Quran itself never comes right out and says that the boy in this story, the al-Khidr story, that he deserved to die because of, his future.
Okay, that is a really important distinction. So if his future isn't the point of the story, what is? What are we supposed to take away from this?
Well, there are a few key details that the book points out that I think often get overlooked. First, it emphasizes al-Khidr's position as a prophet. He wasn't just some guy,
Right, like he's not acting on his own here.
Exactly. He is carrying out a command from God. He received this through divine revelation.
So it's a divinely ordained act.
Right. And the text actually mentions God's mercy over and over again in connection with al-Khidr. And the book makes this point that prophets inherently embody this divine mercy.
So even in this act that we perceive as harsh, there's a thread of compassion.
That we might not fully understand, right? It makes you question what mercy truly is, what compassion really means.
It does. And it makes me think, maybe sometimes true compassion, true mercy, it's just really hard for us to comprehend.
That's a really profound insight. And there's another interesting thing the book brings up, how the language itself changes throughout the story. Like the way that God is referred to, it shifts depending on what's happening.
Okay, yeah, the language thing. It's like sometimes it's I, sometimes we, sometimes your Lord. So what's the deal with all these shifts?
Well, the book suggests that these shifts in how God is referred to actually reflect different levels of direct involvement.
Okay, I think I see where you're going with this. So like sometimes al-Khidr is following God's will, but he has some freedom in how he does it. But other times, God is more directly controlling things.
Exactly. And this seems to be especially true when the story talks about the boy's death. Like the language makes it sound like that specific action, it's being orchestrated by God directly, not just overseen.
Wow. So al-Khidr is almost like an instrument in that moment.
That's exactly how the book describes it. And it goes back to that Abraham and Isaac story again. You remember. In both cases, you have this prophet who basically becomes an instrument of God's will. And what they're asked to do, it just doesn't make sense from a human perspective.
It's like our human ideas of morality. They just kind of fall apart in those situations.
Exactly. So we've gone through all this, the traditional views, this new perspective the book gives us. We've really dug deep into the text itself, but I think the big question is, what does it all mean for us today? Why should we care about this story?
Yeah, it's an old story, and like we've said, it's a difficult one. So what's the takeaway for people listening?
Well, I think at its core, this story is about recognizing that we are limited in our understanding. We don't and we can't always understand God's plan.
It's about accepting that there are things beyond our comprehension.
Yes. And things that might seem harsh or wrong to us, they might actually have this deeper wisdom or even mercy to them. We just can't always see it.
It's almost like it's not our place to judge.
Right.
Like we can't apply our human understanding to these bigger divine actions.
Exactly. And I think it's crucial to remember that the Quran, it never says that violence is okay. It never says that it's all right to hurt someone because of their beliefs. Actually, the opposite is true.
Right. The Quran is really clear about that. Forcing religion on someone, that's a big no.
Huge no. Faith has to come from the heart. It's about individual choice. This story, it's not about justifying violence at all. If anything, it's a reminder that God decides when a life begins and ends. And these decisions, they happen within this framework of like ultimate mercy and wisdom, even if we don't always understand it.
It's a lot to take in. And I think for me, it's a little bit humbling. It's like this reminder that there's so much we don't know.
It is humbling. And I think, sometimes the parts of these sacred texts that are the hardest to understand, the ones that really challenge us, those are the ones that can teach us the most.
It's about being open to that challenge, right? To learning and growing.
Exactly. And remembering that this whole process, this journey of engaging with these texts, it's ongoing. We're always learning.
Always questioning, always reevaluating.
And being wary of anyone who says they have all the answers, especially when those answers are used to justify violence.
So be open-minded, be willing to be challenged, but also be critical. Don't just accept easy answers, especially when it comes to something as complex as faith.
Couldn't have said it better myself.
Well, on that note, I think we've done our best to dive deep into this complex and, let's be honest, disturbing story. But like we've been saying, sometimes it's those difficult stories that have the most to teach us. So until next time, keep asking those tough questions and keep searching for those deeper truths.